3, 2, 1. Allowing a worker to trade off fundamental protections in exchange for a higher salary is no different to companies handing out monetary compensation for the death or injury of a worker. Before I go into my extensions, let's go into 3 claims that they made. I think the first claim is that they will spend money wisely on things that either make them happy or things that will basically help them to basically level them out of their economic or / poverty situation. I think first of all, a major thing that we have to recognize is that a lot of people are short-termists. I think this is especially problematic considering the fact that you are basically giving them the opportunity to trade off their protections and to trade off their health insurance, both of which are basically dependent on the fact that these things are basically obviously long-term things, right? You can't predict yourself getting sick, nor can you predict yourself getting into a major accident, right? I think this is a major thing which has gone basically unnoticed throughout the proposition bench. I think secondly, the fact that they mentioned about catharsis and now they can go on vacations and live like a normal person, I also think that this is very untrue, with the fact especially that in a lot of third world nations or in a lot of countries that are developing, right, I don't think that this marginal increase in wages will necessarily allow them to basically indulge in a lot of these luxuries or necessities that they describe on proposition. The second claim that they make is that this will help them with the economy because now the money will somehow trickle down to the workers and the economy will become better. I think that allowing MNCs to cut costs while basically exploiting the workers that work for them in their own countries is not helping the economy in any way. So I think first of all, the fact that basically you allow these MNCs to basically cut costs is extremely problematic, and that's my third argument. And also the fact that it's actually a lot cheaper for these companies to actually cut costs in terms of worker protection, in terms of healthcare. The fact that now they can do this is inherently problematic, and it does not trickle down to the local average person. I think the last claim is that they basically Ryan claims that there's some fiat that somehow they will basically manage this money wisely, that there's nothing stopping them from gambling it all away. I don't think that proposition has the right to fiat this. I think for a few reasons. I think number one, because workers now have this wage, it's basically under their discretion and their freedom to do whatever they want with it. I don't think it's necessary, or I don't think it's fair to assume that everybody is so rational and so financially educated about basically basic finance that they will necessarily make the correct investments or basically make the rational decisions that we can make because we are in a privileged position, right? But I think secondly, the fact that now everybody's suddenly going to become very rich is also inherently untrue, and I already tackled that. So now let's go into my first argument about how we think it's a form of economic coercion. So this is an extension of my first speaker's speech. We think that it is proven that a lot of people, I think whether or not you're rich, whether or not you're poor, are inherently going to be short-termists. The fact that a lot of people vote for short-termist policies, the fact that people don't see in the long term, I think the fact that people don't care about climate change, I think really reveals to the fact about what our human nature is, right? Is that we basically care about things that come in the short term, right? I think this is extremely problematic. Number one, because of the fact that now you basically dangle this diamond in front of these workers, essentially telling them that now you can get a marginally higher wage, but instead will be taking away your basic protections, right? Your right to basic healthcare and healthcare insurance is extremely problematic, right? I think on top of that, in the long term, I think they see this short-term benefit, and oftentimes a lot of people will take it, right? So they can't necessarily see that people will think rationally and think in the future that they might get injured someday or another, because oftentimes an increase in wage or a marginal increase in wage in the majority of cases is far more attractive than having a health insurance that you are not using in the current term, right? I think secondly, the fact that a lot of the cost of healthcare and the cost of basically any sort of injury or any sort of illness that you will have in the futures is obviously in the long term and is something that you cannot necessarily see, right? I think the fact that people don't see themselves getting injured, people don't see themselves getting sick is extremely problematic, right? Because obviously the fact that now people will basically give up this right and this basic protection in order for a marginally higher income, I think just tells to the fact that this is extremely dangerous for a lot of workers. I think we have to go into the third fact that oftentimes I think side proposition underestimates the number of workplace accidents that happen in a lot of places, right? How many times have you guys gotten sick, right, and gone to the clinic to buy medicine? Oftentimes this is inaccessible for a lot of people because medicine is expensive, right? But obviously we take it for granted because we can't afford to buy it, right? So that's why we don't necessarily see how this will basically create this great economic incentive for these workers in the long term. Before I continue, I'll accept the POI.
The increase in wages is not marginal. I already told you it is proportional to the insurance which they get, which means it's a lot. This means that they have more buying power that inherently stimulates the economy and allows them to get out of their bad financial position.
I think, firstly, I don't think you can necessarily say that this will be exactly how it will work, right? I think oftentimes, like, the way insurance works is that, like, it's oftentimes, like, either a monthly or, like, a yearly stipend or payment, right? I don't think it will necessarily be the fact that now these workers and these, like, basically these firms will suddenly have the incentive to give huge amounts of money. And oftentimes, because of how easily exploitable these workers are in the first place, especially considering the fact that a lot of them will probably opt into this, I think is a major red flag in the first run. Okay, so now thirdly, on how we think that you actually better protect firms but not workers. I think, first of all, it's much easier to basically cover a marginally higher wage for a lot of people in the long run compared to basically investing in better safety facilities, investing in better facilities for workers to have medical treatment, investing in healthcare insurance, right? Because obviously these things incur large and huge costs, which firms obviously don't want, right? Which is why these workplace accidents happen all the time, right? Especially in third world countries, and especially in countries where like firms and corporations are trying to cut costs as much as possible. I think now let's just bring up a major example of this and how we don't think that this financial compensation will even cause a great difference in the first place. I think if you look at the Rana Plaza disaster of 2013, you see that a lot of people who did die or basically get injured, they got compensation, right? They got exactly what side proposition wanted. They got financial and monetary compensation for it. But we see that it's not necessarily a lot, right? And for a lot of people, they still weren't able to cover the full cost of their medical expenses. They still weren't able to cover the full cost of their family's funeral because it was just way too expensive. And these companies have absolutely no incentive nor empathy to cover the cost for these, because obviously their main incentive at the end of the day is their bottom line and their profit. Now let's go into the final argument on basically how we think that it's inherently exploitative. We already tell you from first to second speaker that it is obviously going to be inherently exploitative. The majority of people, I guarantee you, will opt into this because it is far more attractive than a potential health insurance which is hidden, which you don't use currently, right? Because obviously if I get like $1 million now compared to having perhaps investments and savings over many years, obviously most people will take the upfront $1 million because it's far more attractive, and humans are inherently short-termists, right? I think secondly, you put workers at extreme risk, right? Especially because of the fact that workers don't have a lot of financial literacy. There's no guarantee that they'll basically be able to make wise investments, that they'll be able to know how financial or health insurance works in the first place. There's no guarantee that you will basically alleviate them from poverty anyway, especially after how we've explained to you how in many of these cases, these workers and their wages are basically so marginal that there's basically no difference at the end of the day. With that, I've never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.